Eleanor Braddock stood in the doorway of a dying house, staring into a storm that looked ready to swallow the plains whole. The sky above Montana was a black heaving ocean, and the wind howled like a wounded thing through the broken shutters. Rain came sideways, hammering the warped boards and leaking through the roof where the tar had long since peeled away. Inside, the hearth burned low, just enough to show the lines carved deep into her face. She was 34, but the frontier years had stolen more than time. Behind her, her boy coughed again. Tommy was 9 and too thin for his age, pale from a summer that had yielded little food and too much fever. She stirred a pot of cornmeal that was mostly water and forced herself not to look toward the shelf where her late husband's rifle rested. Caleb Braddock had been gone 3 winters now, shot in the back by men who'd claimed they were settling a boundary dispute. The law never came. Out here, justice rode slow or not at all. Lightning flared, and in that brief blue glare, Eleanor saw something move beyond the corral. A shadow, tall, lean. Then came the sound, 3 hard knocks on the front door. Not a timid request. A demand. She froze, hand hovering near the rifle. "Who's there?" Only the rain answered. Another knock, slower this time, deliberate, like whoever stood outside wasn't afraid of what waited behind that door. Eleanor lifted the rifle, cocked it with a sharp click that cut through the thunder. She opened the door. A man stood there, soaked through, hat dripping, boots caked in mud the color of blood. His face was half hidden by the brim, but his eyes caught the lamplight, gray, unreadable. His voice was rough, low. "Ma'am," he said, "if you're needin' a husband, I reckon I could oblige." The wind pushed rain between them, cold and relentless. Eleanor blinked. "You got nerve, mister. Showing up in the middle of a storm with talk like that." The man took off his hat. Water rolled off the brim, tracing the scars along his cheek. "Ain't nerve, ma'am. Just circumstance. I seen your chimney smoke from the ridge. My horse near broke her leg in the mud. I'll fix your roof, mend the fence, see to your fields if you'll let me stay on." She studied him. The lines around his mouth spoke of dust and hunger. He wasn't smiling. This wasn't a courting offer, it was survival talk. Behind him, his mare trembled, ribs showing through her soaked hide. The smell of wet leather and sweat mixed with the scent of ash inside. "Name?" she asked finally. "Clay Mercer." Eleanor kept the rifle trained on him a moment longer. The rain hammered harder. Tommy coughed again from the back room, weak and frightened. She let out a breath that steamed in the cold air. "You'd better come in before you drown, Clay Mercer." He stepped inside, careful not to track too much mud on the floor, though the effort was pointless. His eyes scanned the small room. Table, stove, the picture of Caleb in uniform above the mantel. Clay's gaze lingered there a beat too long before drifting back to her. "You got coffee?" he asked quietly. "Boiled," she said, "if you don't mind it bitter." "I don't mind bitter," he said, settling near the fire, removing his coat. Underneath, a pistol rested low on his hip. Eleanor noticed the worn holster, the ease with which his hand hovered near it. He was a man used to being hunted, or doing the hunting. Outside, thunder rolled again, deeper this time, followed by something sharper, a single gunshot echoing through the storm. It came from beyond the creek, maybe half a mile out. Clay froze mid-motion, head tilted. Eleanor's heart jumped. He rose slowly, every muscle taut. "That wasn't thunder," he murmured. Eleanor gripped her rifle tighter, glancing toward the window where lightning painted the world white for an instant. She saw nothing but rain and black earth, but she felt it. Someone was out there. Clay looked at her with eyes that had seen too much. "You got enemies, ma'am?" She swallowed hard. "Not the kind that knock polite." He nodded once, stepping toward the door. The wind blew cold across the threshold. "Then maybe we both just found 'em." The next flash of lightning showed nothing but open prairie, but in the space between thunder and silence, they both heard it, hoofbeats fading into the distance, swallowed by the storm. By morning, the storm had crawled east, leaving behind a sky the color of dull pewter and a yard turned to thick, sucking mud. The plain stretched wide and washed clean, yet the air still carried that uneasy stillness that follows a night of thunder and gunfire. Eleanor stood at the stove, stirring what was left of the cornmeal, while her eyes kept drifting toward the window. Out there, the stranger from the night before was splitting logs with the steady rhythm of a man used to hard labor. Each strike of the axe landed clean, precise. His coat hung open now, revealing a worn revolver at his side and the edge of an old scar that disappeared beneath his collar. Tommy sat on the porch rail, watching every movement with the quiet curiosity only children have, the kind that notices what adults try to hide. Eleanor poured coffee into 2 tin cups and called through the open door. "Breakfast's ready." Clay Mercer paused mid-swing. He nodded, wiped rain from his brow with the back of his hand, and crossed the yard with boots heavy from mud. When he stepped inside, his presence seemed to fill the small kitchen. The warmth of the stove didn't make him relax. He still moved like a man, half expecting someone to kick the door open behind him. Eleanor set the plate before him. "Ain't much. Leftover meal, bit of lard." He sat, tipped his hat in thanks. "I've eaten less and been grateful." They ate in silence at first, the only sound the scrape of spoons and Tommy's soft breathing near the fire. After a while, Eleanor spoke, voice low but steady. "You said you rode for a cattle outfit once." Clay nodded slowly. "Texas Panhandle. Big spread called the Miller and Crow. We moved herds north through Indian Territory. Sounds honest work." "Was." He looked into his coffee, as if trying to see something far away, till the foreman started branding stolen stock. I spoke up. Eleanor's hand paused on the table, and he smiled without humor. "Let's just say I wasn't welcome no more. Sheriff down in Abilene didn't take kindly to the truth neither, so I kept moving." The word sheriff hung in the air like a warning. Tommy glanced between them wide-eyed. Eleanor said nothing, but her mind turned over that word until it scratched at her nerves. After breakfast, Clay went back outside to tend the corral. The ground squelched under his boots as he worked, hammering loose boards back into place, fixing what the storm had taken. Eleanor swept the floor, but her eyes kept catching the shape of him through the window, steady, deliberate, always aware of his surroundings. When she stepped out to hang the laundry, something glinted near the barn door. She bent down and brushed away wet dirt with her fingers. A small metal badge stared back at her from the mud, an old sheriff's star bent and stained with rust. Her blood, she froze. "Lose something, ma'am?" His voice came from behind her, quiet but close enough to make her heart skip. She straightened, the badge in her hand. "Found something, more like." Clay's eyes met hers, unreadable. "Best you put that back." Eleanor studied him. "You bring trouble with you, Mr. Mercer?" "Trouble don't need an invitation, ma'am," he said softly. "It finds a way." Their eyes held for a long second before she placed the badge back where she'd found it. He covered it again with a bootful of mud, the gesture final. That night the wind returned, whispering through the broken boards of the barn. Eleanor stepped outside, wrapped in her shawl, drawn by the dim glow of a lantern flickering near the fence line. There she saw Clay on his knees, digging into the wet soil beside the old apple tree. He lifted the same badge from the earth, wiped it clean, then buried it deeper, pressing the dirt flat with both hands. She watched from the shadows, saying nothing. Whatever story that badge carried, it wasn't ready to be told. When he rose and turned toward her, she stepped back into the dark. Their eyes met for just an instant across the distance, hers questioning, his resigned. Neither spoke. But something passed between them in that silence, a fragile understanding born from loneliness, loss, and the kind of pain that doesn't need words. Eleanor went back inside, locking the door behind her. She lay awake beside the dying fire, listening to the restless groan of the wind, wondering what kind of man she'd let under her roof. Just before dawn, when the first light broke across the horizon, the distant sound of horses carried through the valley, 3, maybe 4 riders. Their silhouettes rose against the gray sky, heading straight for her land. The morning came harsh and bright, the kind that burns off the fog but leaves the ground slick with memory. Eleanor was mending a broken hinge on the chicken coop when the distant thunder of hooves rolled across the valley. She looked up and saw them cresting the ridge, 3 riders in dark coats riding like they owned the land. Dust trailed behind them, rising against the sun like smoke. Clay came out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes narrowed. "You expecting company, ma'am?" Eleanor felt her stomach turn. "No, but I know who they are." The riders drew closer, 3 men with sharp faces and cruel eyes. The one in front was heavy-set, his hat pulled low and a silver badge glinting on his vest. Silas Farnell, eldest of the Farnell brothers, land barons who called themselves lawmen. Behind him rode Eli and Mac, meaner than their horses, both wearing sidearms polished enough to catch the morning light. When they reached the yard, Silas didn't dismount. He just looked down at Eleanor like she was a stain he couldn't scrub off the county map. "Mrs. Braddock," he said, voice smooth as oil. "Fine morning, ain't it?" She stood her ground, jaw tight. "What do you want, Silas?" He tipped his hat lazily. "Well, now, it's about this piece of property you're on. Seems there's been some confusion about ownership. We filed claim down at the county office last month, paid good money for it, too." "That's a lie," Eleanor said. "This land was my husband's. We worked it near 12 years before you snakes ever sniffed this valley." Silas smirked. "Can't prove that, can you? Word is the deed went missing after your poor husband's unfortunate accident." Clay stepped forward then, slow and deliberate, placing himself between Eleanor and the horses. His coat lifted just enough to show the handle of his revolver. "You boys planning to talk this through, or are we skipping to the part where I start digging holes?" Mac spat in the dirt. "Careful, Drifter. You ain't in uniform no more." Eleanor caught the flicker in Clay's eyes at that. The buried badge. The past he wouldn't name. Silas saw it too, and his smirk deepened. "Well now," Silas drawled. "Seems our little widow's picked herself up a stray lawman. How charitable. Tell you what, Marshal, or whatever you used to be, why don't you mind your own business before you find yourself on the wrong end of it?" Clay didn't move. His voice was low. "I don't take kindly to men who threaten women and call it law." The tension was thick enough to choke on. A hawk cried overhead, slicing through the silence. Silas leaned forward in the saddle, face twisting. "You've got 3 days, Mrs. Braddock. Pack your things, clear out, and leave this land to men who can make use of it. After that, we'll come back with papers and witnesses. And if you're still here..." He let the threat hang like a noose. The brothers wheeled their horses and rode off, laughter trailing behind them like poison. Dust rose and settled again, leaving the yard quiet except for the creak of the windmill. Eleanor turned to Clay, anger and fear mixing in her voice. "If you're running from them, you'll get us both killed." He met her gaze without flinching. "If I'm staying, ma'am, I'll make sure they never come back." She wanted to believe him. But as she looked at the storm gathering in his eyes, she wasn't sure which frightened her more, the Farnells, or the man who had just sworn to protect her. That night, the wind came back strong, howling through the eaves. Eleanor sat by the window, unable to sleep, watching Clay move in the yard. He was rebuilding the fence the brothers had kicked through, hammering new boards under the silver wash of the moon. Each strike echoed like a heartbeat, steady and certain. He worked until his hands bled, until even the night seemed to hold its breath. She thought of her husband, of the way he used to hum while mending fences at dawn, and for the first time in years, she felt something like safety creeping through the cracks of her fear. Just before sunrise, the world fell quiet. The smell of dew and pine filled the air. Eleanor finally drifted to sleep in her chair. When she woke, the light was sharp and gold across the floor. Clay's coat was gone from its hook. His gun belt, too. She stepped outside. The yard was still, the fence mended, the tools put away neat as soldiers. But something was wrong. Down by the creek, 2 men from town were running toward the homestead, shouting. One of them waved his hat, pale-faced and breathless. "Mrs. Braddock," he yelled, "you best come quick." She hurried after them, boots sinking in the wet grass. As they reached the grove past the creek, she saw it. Eli Farnell lying face down in the dirt, a bullet clean through his back. Flies already gathering beside him. A revolver glinted in the sunlight, its ivory handle carved with a single letter, M. Clay Mercer's gun. The sun was bleeding into the hills when the riders came down from the north road, dragging Clay Mercer between them. His hands were bound with rawhide, wrists rubbed raw, his shirt streaked with blood and dust. Behind them, Eleanor Braddock rode hard, her face set against the wind, heart hammering like hooves inside her chest. The town of Redford shimmered ahead through the heat haze. One long, crooked street, lined with shuttered windows and gossip waiting to happen. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer went silent as they passed. Shop doors swung open. People poured into the street, whispering. Clay Mercer, the drifter who'd been hiding out at the widow's ranch, was finally caught. Rumor had already spread faster than wildfire. One of the Farnell boys had been found dead behind the tavern that morning, shot in the back. And Clay's ivory-handled Colt had been found in the dirt beside him. By the time they reached the center of town, a small crowd had gathered outside the saloon. The air smelled of sweat, whiskey, and dust. The setting sun cut long shadows across the faces of men who'd come to see blood instead of truth. The marshal stood waiting by the steps, a broad man with iron-gray hair and a badge that gleamed too clean for a town that dirty. His name was Marshall Denton, and he looked like a man who'd buried too many decisions and not enough bodies. He raised his voice over the murmurs. "Clay Mercer, you stand accused of murdering Jonas Farnell. Shot behind the tavern last night. Witnesses place you nearby. Weapon found with your initials." The crowd shifted, the sound of spurs scraping the boards like restless snakes. Clay said nothing. He just lifted his head and stared at the horizon, eyes empty as the desert. Silas Farnell stood off to one side, his slick black coat brushing against his twin holsters. His face was carved into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Behind him, his men leaned against the posts, hands never far from their guns. Eleanor pushed through the crowd, breathless. "Marshall, he didn't kill that man." The crowd turned. Whispers rippled like wind through wheat. Denton frowned. "Mrs. Braddock, this ain't your fight." "It damn well is," she said. "He was with me that night. We were fixing the barn when we heard the shot. I saw where it came from, up on the ridge behind the tavern. Someone wanted him framed." A murmur rolled through the people, but no one stepped forward. Silas's men were watching too closely. The marshal's hand drifted toward his hat, thinking, calculating. He didn't trust Farnell, but he didn't want to cross him either. Eleanor's voice trembled, but she didn't back down. "You all know what kind of men the Farnells are."
You know what happened to my husband?
"They said it was an accident, but I found the bullet they used still buried in the post by our gate." "Careful, widow," Silas drawled. "You're speaking heavy words for a woman alone." Eleanor reached into her coat pocket. The paper she pulled free was crumpled, stained with soot and age. The ink faded, but clear enough. "Not alone," she said, "and not without proof." She held it up for all to see. A deed bearing Caleb Braddock's signature, the county seal, and the Farnell name scrawled at the bottom where it didn't belong. Gasps broke out. Denton stepped forward, taking it from her carefully, his eyes scanning the lines. "Where'd you find this?" he asked quietly. Eleanor looked at Clay. "He did. Hidden in my rafters. He didn't tell me till last night." Clay lifted his eyes at last, voice low. "Figured truth ought to belong to the one wronged." Silas's face darkened. His hand hovered near his holster. "That paper don't mean nothing. It's old, forged maybe. She's trying to save her pet outlaw." Denton's gaze flicked between the two men. He looked at Clay, bound, bruised, silent, and then back at Silas, who couldn't keep his hand off his gun. The tension thickened. Even the wind seemed to stop moving. Then Eleanor's voice rang out, sharp and steady. "You murdered my husband to steal that land, and now you murdered your own brother to keep it quiet." The words cut like a whip. Silas's hand twitched. Clay saw it first. His shoulders tensed. Time seemed to slow, the crowd sucking in a single collective breath. Silas drew. Gunfire cracked across the square. 1, 2, 3 shots. Horses screamed. Men ducked for cover. Dust exploded from the ground. Eleanor stumbled back, smoke burning her eyes. When it cleared, the marshal was on one knee, gun still raised. Silas lay sprawled in the dirt, clutching his side, blood dark against his white shirt. Clay stood free, the rope around his wrists shot clean through. His revolver hung limp in Eleanor's hand. She didn't remember drawing it, only the heat of the barrel, the ringing in her ears, the silence that followed. The marshal rose slowly, holstering his weapon. His voice was gravel low. "Looks like justice found its own way tonight." Nobody spoke. The Farnell men were frozen where they stood, eyes darting between their fallen boss and the widow who now held the gun. Denton turned to them, jaw tight. "Mount up and ride out. Every last one of you. If you're still in this county by sundown tomorrow, I'll hang you myself." They hesitated, then obeyed, dragging Silas's limp body onto a horse before disappearing down the road in a cloud of dust. When they were gone, Eleanor's knees nearly gave out. Clay caught her before she hit the ground. The revolver slipped from her fingers and thudded softly into the dirt. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked quietly. She nodded, tears glinting in the fading light. "You shouldn't have stayed. You could have run. Some things ain't worth running from," he said. The marshal stepped forward, holding out the folded deed. "This yours, Mrs. Braddock. It's legal, and it's over." Eleanor took it with shaking hands. Clay's blood, mixed with Silas's, stained the edge of the paper. She looked down at it, then up at the dying light stretching across the empty street. The sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the town in fire. Later, as the crowd dispersed and the saloon doors swung shut, the air settled heavy with the kind of silence that follows reckoning. Clay sat on the steps of the jailhouse, wrists still raw, eyes fixed on the last glimmer of daylight. Eleanor stood beside him, holding the deed close to her chest. In the distance, a coyote howled, a lonely, defiant sound. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt the weight of her husband's ghost begin to lift. Justice had come not through law, but through courage, through a drifter who'd chosen to stay when he had every reason to ride on. As the night deepened, the marshal tipped his hat and muttered, "Ain't perfect justice, but it's the kind we get out here." Eleanor looked at Clay, his profile sharp against the fading orange sky. "Then I reckon it'll do," she said softly. The lamps of Redford flickered one by one as darkness swallowed the town. The dust had settled, but the memory of that sundown would never fade. The morning came soft and gold over the Montana Valley, light spilling across the open land like the first mercy after a long war. The night's smoke had cleared. The air carried only the quiet hum of wind through sage and the faint hiss of the creek winding below the ridge. The town of Redford still slept, but out on the Braddock homestead life had already begun to move again. Eleanor stepped onto the porch, her hands shaking as she held 2 tin cups of coffee. Her dress was dusted with ash from the fire that had burned through the night after the shooting, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders. The valley that once looked like a battlefield now felt like something different, a beginning she hadn't dared to imagine. Down near the corral, Clay Mercer stood beside his horse, saddlebags packed, coat drawn tight against the dawn chill. He looked different in the morning light. The hardness that usually lived in his face had softened, replaced by something unreadable, weariness maybe, or peace. Eleanor watched him a moment before calling out, "You leavin' without saying goodbye?" He turned at the sound of her voice. "Didn't figure I was owed one." She walked down the steps, the boards creaking under her bare feet. "You were right, Clay," she said, offering him a cup. "Trouble don't need an invitation." He took it, nodding slightly. "No, ma'am," he said, looking out toward the rising sun. "But sometimes it leaves something worth staying for." They stood in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't demand filling. The wind carried the smell of wet earth and charred wood, reminders of all they'd survived. Beyond the fence, crows circled low over the Farnell pasture, land that no longer belonged to the brothers who'd poisoned it with greed. Eleanor took a slow sip, watching him. "The marshal says the deed's official again," she said. The county clerk came by at first light. "My husband's name is cleared." "Ours too," Clay smiled faintly. "Glad to hear it." "You had a hand in that," she said softly. He set the cup down on the fence post, eyes distant. "Maybe, but I brought my share of ruin before that. Don't reckon a man erases ghosts so easy." From the house, small footsteps scuffed against the porch. Tommy came running, hair a tangle, shirt too big for his thin frame. In his hand, he clutched something small and metal that glimmered in the sunlight. He stopped in front of Clay, chest heaving. "You forgot this," the boy said, holding it out. Clay looked down. Resting in Tommy's dirt-smudged palm was the bent sheriff's star, the same one he'd buried weeks ago behind the barn. The edges were worn, the tin dulled, but the engraving still caught the light. "C. Mercer." Clay stared at it, silent. His throat worked as he reached out and took it gently, like it might crumble under his touch. The star's weight felt heavier now, filled with everything it used to mean. The law, the failures, the man he'd been before his badge turned into a burden. "Where'd you find it?" he asked quietly. Tommy shrugged. "Dug it up. Figured you might want it back." Clay turned it over in his hand. For a long time he said nothing. Then he closed his fingers around it and crouched down so his eyes met the boy's. "Keep that courage of yours," he said. "World needs more of it." Tommy grinned a little. "Ma says courage ain't always loud." "She's right," Clay said. He stood again, slipping the badge into his pocket. Eleanor watched him, her expression unreadable. She could see the fight in him, the pull between leaving and belonging, between the road and the roots he swore he didn't have. He adjusted his saddle and looked toward the horizon. "Reckon I've overstayed." Eleanor's voice was steady but soft. "You reckon wrong." He turned slightly, surprised. She looked at him for a long moment, the wind catching the edge of her shawl. "This place still needs work. Fences broke, roof leaks, and the ground don't till itself." Clay's lips twitched. You offering wages? I'm offering supper, she said. He hesitated, then gave a slow nod. Reckon a man's got to earn his keep. Then you'd best start mending that fence. Clay smiled, the first real smile she'd seen on him. He untied his horse, gave her a long look, then led the animal back toward the barn instead of the road. The sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the land that had nearly been lost. Eleanor stood there a moment longer, watching him move across the yard with quiet purpose. Every swing of the hammer, every board reset, felt like the beginning of something she didn't yet have a name for. Maybe it wasn't love. Maybe it was just the rare kind of trust that's born out of shared danger and hard truth. The wind rose again, sweeping dust over the fields and carrying away the last echoes of the Farnell name. Their land claims were revoked by order of the marshal. The brothers had fled the county before nightfall, their reputation in ruins. Redford was already whispering new stories, ones where justice had come not from the law but from a widow and a drifter who refused to bow. By midday, the valley was alive again. The creek glimmered under the sun, and the sound of the hammer striking wood carried over the hills like a heartbeat. Eleanor took Tommy's hand and led him toward the barn, where Clay worked with his sleeves rolled high, sweat glinting on his arms. She paused, looking out at the wide horizon. We're still here, she murmured. Tommy looked up at her, smiling. Guess that means Pa's watching from heaven. She nodded, eyes bright. Maybe so. Clay paused mid-swing and glanced back at them. Eleanor met his gaze, something warm and wordless passing between them. Then he turned back to the work, shoulders squared, moving with the steady rhythm of a man rebuilding not just a fence, but a life. By sundown, the sky was painted in rose and amber, the air still warm, the land quiet and whole. Eleanor sat on the porch watching the wind bend the tall grass. Inside, the deed lay framed on the mantel beside her husband's photograph. The ink faded but true again. She could hear Clay humming softly to himself in the distance. An old tune, low and steady. The kind that speaks of long roads and second chances. When the last of the light slipped behind the ridge, she whispered to herself, justice found its way. The stars came out one by one, bright and endless over the valley. Somewhere out there, a lone coyote called, answered by another across the hills. And for the first time in years, the Braddock homestead felt alive. A place not haunted by ghosts, but guarded by a man reborn.